us. I'm doing oral history this morning with Nancy Brooks. We are at the Atlanta History Center. It is August the 19th, 2003. Nancy, would you introduce yourself?
I'm Nancy Brooks. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia on March the 3rd, 1930 in Piedmont Hospital when it was downtown.
Where was it downtown? Do you remember? Capitol Avenue? Is that it?
I don't remember, but it was a brick Victorian building. I didn't see it then, but we lived on Piedmont Road near where now is the Buckhead Diner. And I have one brother who is 2 years younger than myself. My mother and my father consisted of our family.
Give me your mother and your father's names.
My mother is Margaret Rusk Brazell, and my father was Henry Dillard Brazell.
And your brother's name?
My brother is James William Brazell III.
How long were you on Piedmont Road?
We were on Mother and Dad bought the house in 1929. I was born in 1930, and we were there until 1941 when we moved to Peachtree Road in Brookhaven.
And what was the address of that house?
3198 Peachtree Road.
And is the house still standing?
No, the house is not still standing.
Has
The
something else taken its place?
The Hastings Nursery now it occupies the property where we lived.
Did you all actually sell the property to Hastings, or did it change hands in between?
No, it changed hands in between, and somewhere in the next 20 years the house burned.
Tell us something about what year did you say you moved to Peachtree Road?
In the summer of 1941.
And tell us something about living in the house during that period.
The house was a yellow brick house, reminds me of the yellow brick road, and it was a fairly large house on 3 acres. We had a tennis court, we had a stable, and we had quite a bit of grass to cut.
Were you a tennis player, and did you ride?
No, but sometime while we lived there, we found a diamond ring in the court.
In the tennis court?
Yes, that apparently had slipped off of someone's hand. Later, Mother had it mounted along with other diamonds, and it was some lost wedding band that someone had.
Oh my goodness. Amazing.
The house was a 2-story house with a full basement.
How many rooms downstairs? What were the rooms downstairs?
The rooms downstairs were a living room, a dining room, a sun parlor, a breakfast room, a kitchen, and a den, and a half bath.
And what about upstairs?
Upstairs there were 4 bedrooms and 2 baths.
In the kitchen, what were some of the modern conveniences in the kitchen that you had then that we may take for granted now?
We had a gas stove, freestanding. We had a mangle, which we used to iron sheets and pillowcases and shirts and things of that nature. The icebox was on a porch attached to the kitchen. We did not have a refrigerator, but we used ice for refrigeration.
And how was the ice? How did you get the ice?
The ice was delivered twice or more a week in large blocks. My dad was in the ice manufacturing business. He was a engineer. He was in charge of all of the plants in the southeast on up to West Virginia for American Service Ice Company, as far as the keeping the plants running and doing any improvements and what have you. During that time, all produce and meat were transported by refrigerated freight car. There were not the refrigerated trucks. And the refrigeration consists of large blocks of ice. This was true throughout the country.
Do you know where the ice came from? I mean, summertime in Atlanta, you'd have to look pretty far.
There were several plants with different manufacturers here in Atlanta. American Service Company plant was in southeast Atlanta, across the street from Kraft Food Warehouse. Rather than Kraft Food having its own refrigeration service, brine was pumped under the street to Kraft Foods for refrigerating the produce and the meat.
What street were they located on?
I don't recall.
What else was in the kitchen?
Lots of built-in cabinets, a built-in ironing board. The overhead, the ceilings were quite high, 10 to 11 feet, and so the kitchen cabinets reached to the ceiling. There was a tile countertop and a single large sink.
No disposal in those.
No disposal, no trash compactor, nothing of that nature.
The telephone, where was the telephone?
The telephone was in a hall that connected to the kitchen, the den, and the living room and the stairs upstairs.
And was there just one telephone?
No, we had another telephone in Mother and Dad's bedroom upstairs.
Was the house air conditioned in any way?
We didn't need the air conditioning, even though it was in Atlanta, because every room was a corner room.
So how did you keep cool?
Get the windows open.
Nice draft.
Good circulation throughout that house. It did get very hot in the summertime, and humid, but we managed to stay cool. We also had in the basement a very large playroom. Most of the basement area was below grade, and that room and the others in the basement stayed cool throughout the summer.
What about wintertime? How was the house heated?
The house was heated with gas heat. It had been converted from coal. The furnace had been converted from coal-fired to gas, natural gas. My brother's workshop in the basement had been the coal bin. It had one external window and the coal chute. We had laundry facilities in another room where Mother had a washing machine with a wringer and double laundry tubs and a half bath. And then there were 3 additional rooms where we stored foods during World War II that had been canned or processed and sealed.
Well, let's move on and talk a little more specifically about the war and some of the activities in the house. What kind of stories do you remember from the time?
Well, we lived on the trolley line on Peachtree Road near the end. The end was in the general vicinity of Oglethorpe University. We were about a mile from the end. The servicemen who were from Fort McPherson the servicemen who were from the Naval Air Station, which is now DeKalb Airport, the servicemen who were on the staff at the Veterans Hospital on Peachtree Road, and the service people who were patients in the surgical wards that were at Camp Gordon would come in groups of 3 to 5 on Sunday for dinner. Mother would cook a good old Southern home-style dinner for these people.
How did they hear about it? How did they know, or were you all the only family? Did every family do this?
Many families did this. Mother was very active in the Red Cross and in volunteer work at the Veterans Hospital, and the USO would develop lists of people who would do this. And we might get someone from New York, someone from Detroit, people who were quite far away from home in a new environment and on their way to war or back from war.
What did a Sunday dinner consist of?
Oh, fried chicken, rice, homegrown corn, tomatoes, beans, and a specialty dessert that was an apple pie that had a crust on top but not on the bottom.
Oh, is that an old family recipe?
No, it was generated sometime during the period prior to World War II and became quite popular. It was shared through the Atlanta Journal food section.
Recipes?
The food section in the Atlanta Journal then was loaded with recipes on Thursdays, as is traditional now with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. There were many other home craft type things in there. A tremendous section on needlework and sewing and this sort of thing was common.
Were there any of the soldiers, would they just come once, or was there somebody who was maybe a regular, anybody in particular that you can remember?
Not anyone in particular. This is something that we did most Sundays when the weather was good. They would have to come on public transportation to our house and spend the day. Of course, we had all sorts of games. We had badminton on the tennis court, any number of other lawn-type games, and we'd had great fun. I was 11 to 14 during that period, and I would develop a crush very quickly on one of the guys. My brother was 9 to 12 during that period. The other thing that happened later during the war was there was a tremendous need for housing, temporary housing for many of the families of service people who were stationed more or less permanently, particularly at the hospitals. Doctors, families, interns, various others. And because housing was extremely critical, Mother rented out 2 rooms and a bath to these people that were there for several months. She did not provide food for them, but there was one family I can remember, a physician and his wife, and 3 or 4-year-old plus a 6-month-old and a nurse staying in 2 of the bedrooms that had been mine and my brother's for a number of months. Where they got their food, I don't know.
And where did you and your brother stay?
We were in the
room?
guest room at that point in time and not liking it.
Didn't want to share a room with your brother?
No, far too old to do that, I thought.
Did your mother, do you remember if she charged them and what she
Oh,
charged
yes.
them? Do you know what she charged them for the room?
She charged rent for the rooms. I don't recall what it was, but it was very nominal. We had a full-time maid when we first moved there, but we lost her during the latter part of the war because there was such a critical shortage of people like that the hotels, some of whom were housing service people, were able to beat the price. The maid had salary from us daily, $1.25 plus car fare and totem privileges.
And how much was car fare?
As I recall, it was a dime.
And then what are toting privileges?
It enabled her to take the leftovers from dinner home to her husband.
And what was her name? Do you remember?
Carrie, C-A-R-R-I-E. And we used to sing "Carry Me Back to Old Virginia" to her incessantly. She had been with us 8 or 10 years by the time that she was lured away by more wages and commercial housing.
On Sundays during the wartime, you had some soldiers come. Weekdays, were you in school?
I was first in school in Brookhaven in a school that was across the railroad tracks from our house in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades.
Was it called Brookhaven Elementary?
Well, it was just called Brookhaven School. It went from 1st grade through 9th grade. One of my teachers was a man who was called off to service. Broke my heart.
Remember the name?
Mr. Estes. He was later on the staff at Emory University.
And after Brookhaven, you said you went to Brookhaven through the 8th grade?
Through the 9th grade, and then I went junior and senior years to North Avenue Presbyterian School out on Ponce de Leon. I commuted to that by trackless trolley, changed with a transfer at the Fox Theater, walking 1 block from West Peachtree to Peachtree to a streetcar. Occasionally, on the way home, I would do the transfer downtown, which permitted me to go into the department stores. Mother had okayed my ability to charge at the department stores. Now, mind you, this was when I was 14 and 15 years old.
And so what year would this be?
And 44 and 45. And I had free reign in the department stores.
And the names of the department stores, where was your favorite place to shop?
Riches, Davidson, Paxson, and I could also had permission to go to Thompson, Bull and Lee, which sold shoes. Dad would occasionally meet all of us downtown at the S&W cafeteria, which was across from Davison's. And
Davison's was on what street?
Peachtree Street, next to the Weinkauf Hotel, across the side street from the Weinkauf Hotel. We'd either eat dinner there and watch the cartoons, which they had for the children, while Mom and Dad stood in line.
At the
at the S&W, or the Francis Virginia Tea Room, which was diagonally across from Davison's up on the second floor. Francis Virginia Tea Room had awfully good food too.
What was your favorite thing to get? Do you remember what you would get at the cafeteria? Or in the tea room? Was there a favorite?
I have the Francis Virginia Tea Room cookbook, and it's hard to give you the favorite out of that. They made an awfully good salads as well as, and that was one of the few times we got salads, was at the cafeteria and at the tea room.
What did you wear to school? What would you wear to school?
A skirt and a blouse and a sweater. At naps, we wore skirts and sloppy Joe sweaters.
What's a sloppy Joe sweater?
It's a real sloppy sweater, oversized and hanging around your hips with a great big blouse on thing. I knitted most of mine. I had a dozen or so. But the other types of sweaters that were worn were twin sets that were cashmere. We didn't afford those, but they were very popular.
Shoes, was there a popular shoe at the time?
I had difficulty getting the popular shoes because my foot was too long.
How tall were you in high school?
I was 5'10" and a half. I had grown 11 inches the year I was 11. And I was the tallest one in my class and the youngest one, always. I'm still the tallest and the youngest. Nevertheless, shoes were rationed during World War II. You could get 1 or 2 pair a year. I wore Oxfords, and they were not always the saddle shoes that were two colors. It was mostly the dark brown Oxfords. I enjoyed having a foot that was size 11, 6A, and Thompsonville and Lee was the only store that could fit me at all in what was called children's or young person's shoes. They x-rayed our feet to determine the size.
Describe the x-ray machine.
You stood up on a platform and put both of your feet in underneath the x-ray machine, and they'd press, it was against a scale, and they'd press the button and x-ray your feet to determine whether your bones were straight or what have you, and determine the size of your foot. This was in addition to measuring the foot with a metal scale. But it was a delight to see your toes in that thing wiggling around.
I remember that fondly. During the war, what did you all, you mentioned that shoes were rationed. You mentioned that you couldn't get a salad. What were some of the rationing? How did you get coupons? Did you all need coupons? Did you grow your own? What sort of things?
Many things were rationed in the way of food items. Meat was rationed. We ate an awful lot of canned salmon, which was not. Butter was rationed. Sugar was rationed, and a number of other items. Both of my grandfathers were living, and both of them had gardens, and we had a garden too when we lived on Peachtree Road. We grew most of the fresh vegetables. Corn was always a failure, but tomatoes were the size almost of a child's head. They were enormous. The beans were a favorite thing to grow, lima beans, and many of the fruits. Mother planted a fruit tree section of the garden, but we did not live there long enough to get a lot of fruits off of the trees. We would occasionally go to the farmer's market in South Atlanta to get fresh vegetables for canning purposes, and we canned a lot of what we grew plus a lot of what we didn't grow for the winter time.
A quick question is I want to talk about the canning. To get to the farmer's market on the south side of Atlanta, how would you get there? Would you take?
We would drive, but generally it would be a carpool situation where we'd go with another family or two and buy things by the bushel.
Fill up the car and bring it back.
Fill up the car and bring it back. Mother had a 1939 Packard, which was the largest car anyone in her circle of friends had, and it had a large trunk and had tremendous capacity. We enjoyed those trips because they were rare, and it was just a delight to go to the farmer's market.
Did you learn to drive on the Packard?
No, I was too young.
Oh, I didn't know if she still had it. Did you get a license at 16?
No, gas was rationed, and at 16 I went to college. The licensing, some of my classmates in high school did have licenses and their own cars, which was sort of astounding considering how short we were of gasoline. I need to stop a minute.
We have come back after a short break, and Nancy Brooks has a list of stories that she wants to make sure we get. And so, Nancy, I'm going to ask you to just start at the top of the list.
I want to talk about the beginning and the end of the war. I don't recall exactly where I was when we first got news of Pearl Harbor, but my uncle and aunt, Mother's brother and sister-in-law, and their two children, Harold Rusk and Alice Rusk, and their first two children were in Pearl Harbor. Harold was in charge of all of the construction that was going on in Pearl Harbor itself. Alice was 9 months pregnant when this occurred. He got a call to come to the base on that Sunday morning, and he went, and he did not even have contact with Alice for several days. He, being in charge of, as a civilian in charge of the construction, helped organize the situation as far as using the construction equipment to remove the debris, using the trucks to carry the bodies, and it was a tremendous worry to the family here that we had not heard any news from them. There was no email, telephones were out, there was no power in Pearl Harbor, and Alice was pregnant. He eventually got through to her that he was safe and that he would be home in a few days, and this is a matter of going across town to where they lived. They had been there about a year. The very next year, at Christmas time, they came to the States, and their then 1-year-old would be left with us while they went back to Ridgewood, New Jersey, where a house had been under construction for them. I recall David, the 1-year-old, scooting across Mother and Dad's bed without any clothes on, just totally delighted. This was the dead of winter in Atlanta, Georgia. Dad got the biggest charge out of that. His first word that he spoke of anything that you could understand was light. He had never seen a room light. They had been in total blackout for the first year of his life. So this is a story that we always tease him about at this point in time. He stayed with us about a month until their house was ready and they moved in. But Alice and Harold had taken the 2 older children to New Jersey to await the completion of their house. I vividly remember the days that he would be totally free of any clothes. Of course, in Hawaii, he had never worn clothes but a diaper. Earlier in the process, my brother had saved money to buy a bicycle. He had saved every dime. He had even had a Coca-Cola stand in the front yard when we lived on Piedmont Road and later on Peachtree Road, and saved money through selling Coca-Colas. A bicycle became available, and Dad managed to get it. Those were rare things to be able to buy during the World War II. But he bought it with Jim's money. Jim knew how to ride it immediately, and we were permitted to ride it on our yard, but not up and down Peachtree Road. I learned to ride it but couldn't steer it. And the lot sloped. And one of the first times I was on the bicycle, it encountered a large pine tree dead center and bent the frame. I didn't have a bicycle, but the next day I had a bicycle. These were balloon-tired bicycles.
I was thinking rubber was in short supply, wasn't it?
These were brand new balloon-tired bicycles. Dad, being very close to the shipping industry, managed to secure them. How, I don't know. They were not in the hardware stores where you would normally buy them. I used to love to go swimming at North Fulton Park. It was North Fulton rather than Chastain then. And we lived about 5 miles from the swimming pool. I was permitted to ride my balloon-tired bicycle with no gears to North Fulton Park by myself to go swimming. That's the only way I could get to the swimming pool in the summertime.
It was a pretty long ride for you. Wasn't
It was from Peachtree in Brookhaven, down Peachtree to Wyuka, to
Wyuka all the way over.
West Wyuka, to what is now Chastain Park.
And no gears, that's sort of hilly, isn't it?
It's hilly. It was a hard climb back, but I did it a number of times. It was a challenge.
Did you do it by yourself or were there friends?
Oh no, I did it by myself. Now imagine a 12-year-old going on those roads on a bicycle that is not controllable with gears to a park that is just loaded. But that pool park is over 50 years old. The
Do you have another story? Or
oh yeah,
that's what we wanted.
Mother was very active in the Red Cross and also in civilian defense. She became a leader in the civil defense activities here in the north part of Atlanta. Our house, because of its structure, was designated to be an air raid shelter. We had 7 rooms on the basement level with very few windows. She constructed blackout curtains for those that were there, and our playroom became a designated air raid shelter. We stocked it with provisions for housing a number of people, cots, blankets, that sort of thing. We stored large 5-gallon jugs of water, and we had all the food that we had canned. So we did have ability to feed people there. It was never used as an air raid shelter, but we thought it was delightful that we were the center of attention for the neighborhood. The house had a flat roof. It was one of the only houses in the area that had a flat roof, and they would train the naval pilots at the Naval Air Station to use our roof as a guide to their practice bombing runs. This was a very noisy thing, but that was it.
Let's not forget to get back to the canning and talk about that.
Okay.
We'll do that after you finish your list. But
It's okay. Dad, during World War II, being in ice manufacturing, was used as a consultant at Redstone Arsenal in Anniston, Alabama, to help design and develop the refrigeration requirements for the weapons that were stored there. The poisonous gases and any of the other weapons that were stored underground there. We didn't know what he was doing at the time, but we knew he had often gone to Anniston, Alabama, where he had no plants, and stayed for a week or 10 days. In later years, we did find that out that was the purpose of him going there. He was not inducted or drafted during the war because he was considered to be in a critical industry. The refrigerated freight cars carried all the food for the troops, for the populace, and everything. So one of the problems that he had was to keep the plants running without having the ability to get new equipment. He had to cannibalize from one of the plants that would fail to give other plants parts. There were 30 some odd plants under his purview, and he traveled incessantly to those plants, sometimes by car and sometimes by air. We would occasionally meet him at the airport when he came in, and we would dearly love to go out there just to meet him. It was a rare occasion. He was in his 40s at that time, and a chemical and mechanical engineer, and was subject to the draft, but he was never part of it. He, because of the requirements of his job, he got a C ration gasoline coupon, and he was able to buy tires, which were rationed. We had to buy retread tires for Mother's car, but he was able to get tires for his, and he traveled quite a bit on non-interstate country roads to get from one plant to another. Was gone a significant amount of the time.
If he oversaw 30 plants, were the 30 plants in Georgia and Alabama, or further?
They were in Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia.
That is a lot of driving.
I recall being delighted when he came home because he had several copies of the most recent Life magazines with all the good pictures in them. We were enamored of our National Geographic magazines because of the pictures, and the Life magazines made the war real. It was, I can see them opening his suitcase to this day with 3 copies of the newest Life magazines. And he would also have a bottle of moonshine in there. One time when he was traveling, he was going from one Tennessee town to another, and he had a flat tire on a country road. And he got out to change the tire, and suddenly he felt the presence of a number of other people around him. And there were 6 or 7 of the local populace standing around him in the dark with their shotguns, and they watched him change the tire. No one helped. They thought he was a revenue, finding there still. From then on, he carried a sawed-off shotgun in the front of the car on the seat for protection should he encounter some opposition. I don't think he ever used it. Because Dad was gone such a long time, and so many times, it was a problem to Mother to be alone in the home with 2 children, though we were teenagers. Dad was fond of squirrel hunting and bird hunting, and he had a number of guns. He would take us squirrel hunting at times, and we would do target practice in our backyard. Our backyard was 3 acres of backyard, so there was no danger to anyone near us. He did teach me how to use some of the pistols, and I became quite confident in my ability to shoot straight. One night, in the middle of the night, someone made a noise outside our house, and Mother came running in to me and said, "We've got a burglar in the house." Somebody had opened the front door and slammed it, and she was afraid. Dad did keep one of the pistols on the 2nd floor, and I got the pistol and loaded it and waited for the police to come. Mother had called the police. She had not only called the Fulton County Police, but she had called the DeKalb County Police. We lived in DeKalb County just over the Fulton County line, but the DeKalb County Police had to come from Decatur. Once they came, we went downstairs, and I was carrying the pistol in my pajamas and robe, Mother in her robe, and we went to the front door to let them in. They had looked all around the house. They had driven down behind the house and back up through the loop. They had looked at all the doors, and the sheriff the policeman handed Mother the evening paper that was stuck in the front door. She had missed the paper that night and had called to get another one. I was still holding the gun, and the sheriff said, "Young lady, what do you have?" I was about 13 at the time. And I said, "Oh, this is a Spanish gun, pistol that's similar to a German Luger." He says, "Is it loaded?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Show me." And he said, "You better hand me that gun." But that was my one time of defending the household with a gun. I never aimed it at anybody, but I was carrying it around.
You were prepared. You were prepared.
I was doing what Dad said that I could do, but not necessarily what I should do. Okay, shall we can a little bit?
All right, let's do that. Tell me about canning. You've mentioned it several times. Did you help your mom do this?
Yes, I did.
What's the process of canning?
First one cooked things like beans, normally, but not as done as we did beans in those years. We left a little stiffness to them. You boiled and sterilized both the canning lids and the glass mason jars, and you prepared a hot water bath for your canned items. You ladled the beans and their juices into the jars, put on a lid to them and screwed the lid down with a ring and boiled them for another hour. Then you took them out of the jars, out of this bath, and listened for the pop when the suction was developed, and then stored them away. We did dozens of cans of beans or tomatoes or corn or a tomato soup mix at a time in the hot summertime in that enormous kitchen. Fortunately, the kitchen was enormous, or we would not have been able to handle that. These were stored then in the basement, and during the later part of the years when you could not get fresh vegetables, we would utilize those for our meals. Mixture of tomatoes and corn and okra and lima beans was used for homemade vegetable soup. Very, very good. Since we couldn't get meat, but we could get bones, meat was rationed, so it was scarce, we could get soup bones, and we'd make some broth with some soup bones and use a can of the tomato soup mix. We added to it packages of alphabet noodles and celery and other seasonings to make the soup when we were used the canned things. A good bit of this came from my grandfather's garden, who happened to live next door to us, from Mother's garden, and then of course from the farmer's market. It was a savior during World War II.
So did you ever, what was a typical meal like for breakfast? And then
Breakfast was something like bacon and eggs and oatmeal.
so you could get bacon, you couldn't get other meats, but you could get
Bacon was rationed, but we could get it. We could also get sausage. Some of the people who lived in the area had pigs and did do sausage. Dad's company had at several of the plants curing facilities for hams that the farmers would bring into the plant, and they would do salt-cured hams. We were able to get those.
Did you all have any chickens, or did you?
No, my grandfather had chickens next door. Both before World War II and during World War II, there was an excellent chicken market in Buckhead where you'd go and pick out the chicken on foot, and they would kill it and pluck it right then and there, and you'd go home with the chicken that you selected.
Do you remember where that chicken?
It was off of East Paces Ferry, right near Peachtree and East Paces Ferry.
Downtown Buckhead today.
Downtown Buckhead today. One of our recreational activities was to go bowling. There was a bowling alley on Peachtree Road in Buckhead, and we were able to do that. We were able to go there on the trolley, on the trackless trolley, and have an evening bowling. It was a favorite thing to do.
Was there anything else in the Buckhead area that you did?
Well, of course, we hung out at Winder and Roberts in the summertime, and
That was a
drugstore, the dime store, the Five and Dime, the hardware store. Atlanta's first supermarket was in Buckhead. And
Is that on Peachtree, across the street from?
it was on yes, it was on Peachtree, across the street from the bank, Fulton National Bank. And
What was the super grocery store like, the supermarket?
well, of course, it had a lot of canned things. It had a meat department. It had limited produce. Then a second supermarket opened in Buckhead on Peachtree that was across from Peachtree Road Presbyterian Church, where we went to church. This one had a novel thing called a frozen food unit. We didn't buy frozen food because we didn't have a refrigerator. We had an ice box. But I can recall the frozen food unit with Bird's Eye Foods in it that was all of about 4 feet wide. That was the entire space given over to frozen food in the market. So it was very austere, but it was the newest, hottest thing. But if you didn't have a refrigerator and give up one of the ice trays, you couldn't store frozen food.
Let's talk a little bit, you said that your father was not drafted because of his position. Were there any other people in your family that did serve?
Mother's younger sister, Aunt Nana Rusk, was a nurse at Emory Hospital. She was a graduate of Emory University, and she joined the activated Emory unit that became integrated with the 43rd General Hospital during World War II. She was a first lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps at that time, and was in the service from 1942 until 1945. She went to Camp Livingston in Louisiana, where several hundred of her associates, doctors and nurses from Emory, organized a hospital and were there approximately a year before they were transported to overseas. They went as a second-line hospital first to North Africa and Algeria, Oman, Algeria. They received the soldiers who had already been treated at an advanced hospital and determined whether they needed additional treatment and whether they could be put back into the front lines or had to be returned home. She served as surgical nurse in the maxillofacial operations. They were later transported to Italy when the Algeria was liberated from the Italians, and served there in a shipboard hospital. From there they went to southern France, AIX France, to a hospital that the Germans had just evacuated. The hospital originally was designed as a tuberculosis hospital, but never had been used for that. About half of their patients were Americans and about half of the patients were German. The Germans whom they held as prisoners of war after they had been somewhat rehabilitated became interns, even though there was a language barrier. They did serve with the medical corps. After the war ended, they came back and were discharged from the nursing corps. The Emory unit as a whole came back to Emory.
What did she do after the war?
After the war, Nana used the GI Bill to study interior design at Parsons in New York. Then she went to the West Coast, Beverly Hills, and worked in interior decorating for one of the large department stores. Later she came back to Atlanta and re-entered nursing. She then became the first dean of women at Emory University, and for 10 years served in that position. At the conclusion of that, she was invited to join the Peace Corps in an administrative position to go to North Africa. She was headquartered in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, but traveled to Kenya, Uganda, a number of the other countries in North Africa. She oversaw the volunteer staff that was medical in training during those years at North Africa. She returned to Washington for a year and then came to Atlanta and joined the Georgia Council on Aging for the state. She enjoyed 5 pensions from her various activities and the various services. She was quite an illustrious person.
Did she ever marry?
She married at age 60 for the first time to a bachelor who was 70, and he was Dean Emeritus of the School of Law of the University of Georgia. He had been dean there for the longest period of time of any dean of any law school in the nation. He developed a very severe neurological disorder and died of it. Later she married a physician who was retired, who had taken his medical training at Emory, and her health problems built up and she died.
When did she die?
She died in 1992. She was 78. And she is the only aunt or uncle on mother's side that had no children.
From a large family?
Mother was from a family of 6. Her father was a family of 11. From the 11, there were 60 first cousins. Most are deceased at this point in time, but most continued to live in this area. One of Mother's and Nana's first cousins was Dean Rusk, who was our Secretary of State during the Kennedy years.
And he came back to Georgia, didn't he?
He retired to the University of Georgia and as a professor of international law, and was responsible for setting up their international law program. And then he retired from that, but he remained active there.
Did you know much, when he was Secretary of State for Kennedy, any stories from that time?
I have a personal story from that time.
Can you tell it?
I was working in research at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica on classified projects, and I was had a private office, as did most of the technical staff members. Suddenly there appeared in the office next to me a new employee, or introduced as a new employee, a man that insisted he had known me in prior years. Having been in a field that consisted almost entirely of men, I figured, well, I've seen him somewhere sometime, but he insisted that he knew a lot about me. This went on for several days, and it was rather strange that he wound up in the cleared area where everybody had to have a clearance on the first day of his employment. Normally it took several weeks to have your clearance certified before you were permitted into that area. I was called up to the security officer's office quite often at that period and asked questions about my background. And I had had a security clearance for well over 10 years at that point, and told them that I knew nothing about this man, and my background stories were the same that they'd always been. The RAND Corporation is in Santa Monica, just a few blocks from downtown Santa Monica. I went shopping at noon one day and heard over the radio that Dean Rusk had been selected as Kennedy's Secretary of State. I came back to the office and the man was gone, and suddenly the light dawned. What they had done was put a surveillance on every member of his extended family who had any security clearance anywhere in the United States, to verify that there was no problem. This included my uncle, my aunt, my father, the whole bunch of us that had had anything to do with classified information for the whole time. It was a relief to realize that he was there purely as a spy, so to speak, on you.
Wow.
Powerful stuff. They did their vetting very well.
I'd also like to go into some of your story. I think you have a fascinating story. You graduated from NAPS, and what happened next?
I was 16, and I graduated the quarter I was 16. I had a bent toward engineering and had not been discouraged by my dad or any of his engineering friends. So I decided I was also talented in art and design. So architecture appeared to be the natural course for me to take because of the math ability and the design ability. Georgia Tech was not co-ed at that time. This was in 1946. The veterans were returning from World War II. Many of them took advantage of the GI Bill. I could not go to Georgia Tech, but the closest place I could go to was Auburn, Alabama Polytechnic Institute. So I enrolled there in a 5-year program, as it was then, and to some extent still is now. I was 16, the next youngest member of my class, which were all men, was 7 years older than I. Many of them had been to war, had had families, and were there on the GI Bill. There was only one other member of my class of about 200 who, in architecture or in the School of Architecture, who had not been in the service. They decided at the end of the first year to go full-time summers straight on through because of their family situation. We had several classes that were 15 quarters long. We did it in 3 3/4 years. I graduated in 1950, barely 20 years old, and entered the architectural profession here in Atlanta. I was here about a year, working for John Cherry and Associates on Peachtree Road, near Pershing Point, doing commercial and industrial buildings, designing and drawing the plans for them and monitoring the construction, writing the specifications, things of that nature that you'd find in a normal architectural firm. The Korean War broke out and we were unable to get structural steel for these buildings, so I decided it was a good time for me to go to graduate school. My structures professor at Auburn, William Honor, encouraged me to go on to graduate school and arranged for me to get a research assistantship at the University of Illinois. I went there in the fall of 1951, barely 21, as the first woman who had ever attempted to get an advanced degree in civil engineering, and the first woman member of the research staff ever. I achieved my master's in 1953. By then I had married one of my associates and stayed there on the staff, continuing my graduate education until such time as my husband finished his PhD. We went to the West Coast, both of us receiving excellent jobs in protective construction, weapons effects on structures. John was at TRW, I was at the RAND Corporation for about 7 years. This was in 1955. For about 7 years I stayed at RAND, and then an opportunity developed for me to join with 4 others and form our own small research firm. RAND gave us the blessing, maintained us on full-time consulting status until we had a chance to get contracts in hypervelocity impact, which is, again, another area of studying the vulnerability of structures to high-speed impact, which is caused by thermonuclear devices. For 5 years we developed that firm. We had some 50 employees, and then we were acquired by the Whitaker Corporation, which is a Fortune 500 company at that time. I left and went into consulting for a year for the very firms that I had done business with, and then ultimately joined the staff at General Research Corporation in Santa Barbara in 1970. Was there until 1980, doing research on a number of dynamic systems problems that arise in engineering that require the use of high-speed computers. At Illinois, I had learned to program the computer that was developed there, and that was a talent that I had carried with me throughout these years. I was always able to use the very large digital computers that were new, and those that were not even then made to satisfy the requirements of the research work I was doing. The bulk of it was classified, so I'm not well published, but it was a very fascinating career, almost all the time being the only woman in that field. My husband took great pride of being introduced as Nancy Brooks's husband at technical conferences. There was no other man that could be introduced that way. We had a lot of fun about that situation.
Were there any stories in particular that where you're coming in as a woman that you remember?
Ah, yes. At Illinois, I was once giving a briefing to some of our sponsors who represented the military or ARPA or one of the organizations, and this consultant to the sponsor was from an older person from Germany. He had seen through the World War II during Germany. I finished my presentation, and he said to me in his broken English that he almost put me to sleep because I reminded him of his grade school teacher being in front of him during class telling him to wake up. On another occasion, I had to develop a lower pitch to my voice because I found that making presentations to the military and to other technical people, my southern drawl came out too much. So I gradually lowered the pitch, spoke more clearly, and essentially lost my drawl, which I have gotten back to some extent now. There was an occasion in the time that I worked at General Research Corporation that I had to make a presentation in Huntsville, Alabama to a room full of military people at 7:30 in the morning. We had caught the red-eye from Los Angeles. Several had flown in on the company plane from Santa Barbara, and were due to arrive in Huntsville about 3 o'clock in the morning. Pantsuits for women were just beginning to appear in California and not in the rest of the country. I decided to wear a pantsuit on the plane and then change when we got to Huntsville. My presentation was to be the first one on the agenda. Fortunately, I had a three-piece suit that included a skirt, but I wore the pants on the plane. We arrived in Huntsville and my baggage, including the skirt, had not arrived. We had not been able to carry any personal items on the plane because we were carrying a large amount of classified material that required constant surveillance, and we could not carry personal items. We checked into the motel to catch some sleep before our presentation, and then while we were eating breakfast in the hotel area, a taxi cab drove up and had my skirt in my baggage. I had slept in my underwear. It was a fairly warm point in time, and there wasn't any air conditioning in the motel. And I was feared getting in front of a bunch of military in a pantsuit when they were not being worn in the other parts of the country, but there I was. While I was at Illinois, we were on some research projects that were similar to ones at MIT and Illinois Institute of Technology, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and other universities. There was a conference set up in Boston for all of these similar projects, and I traveled with others from Illinois to Boston to make a presentation. That was much before the pantsuit era. I wore a skirt. We were shown through, not in or at, but through the large-scale digital computer that they had at that time, the Whirlwind 1, aptly named. It was housed in a 3-story building. The control center for the computer, the console, was on the 2nd floor. The structure consisted of a steel structure with grate floor so the air could go through. the computers had enormous amounts of air conditioning. I had on a gathered skirt, and as I walked into the control room, that skirt went up over my head, a la Marilyn Monroe. That was the first time I saw a woman in slacks at a job. She was the operator. Needless to say, I adapted pantsuit as soon as I could.
That's wonderful. We've got about 10 minutes left. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to get on tape?
Oh, let's see. I mentioned that I knitted most of my high school sweaters. I learned to knitting for the Red Cross during World War II. There would be a group at the church, Peachtree Road Presbyterian Church, that would get together every few weeks or every week to knit for the soldiers. And I learned basic knitting there. We did mittens, we did gloves with 5 fingers, we did helmet-like ski masks, and we did long scarves that you would wrap around your neck out of this awful, awful olive drab wool that was coarse, scratchy, and how in earth anybody ever wore that, I don't know.
Was the wool supplied?
The wool was supplied by the Red Cross, and we did that. So I had learned to knit doing that. The first sweater that I knit, I bought the wool for myself. I bought the wool at Davison Paxson, and it was a red, bulky knit, large gauge wool, and I used enormous wooden needles to knit it. Feeling challenged and with a math background, I knit a cardigan, which was a cable stitch cardigan as my first real garment. I nearly wore the wool out, taking things out and putting them back in, because I had made an error. Perhaps I had knitted once too many instead of pearl, but that was the challenge. That was the first garment that I made.
Do you still have the sweater?
Oh, no, but I remember it vividly. It was with cable stitches up the sleeves and up the front and up the back.
And was it one of the oversized like you were talking about?
No, it was not one of the oversized. It was a fairly short one. But that was my first experience knitting garments. I followed all the instructions exactly. I think that I'm about talked out.
All right. You've got a few pictures there. Could you show those, and let's just talk about some of the pictures that you brought, and we'll make copies of those pictures. I'm going to aim the camera down and the pictures to go close up.
Can you see that?
If you want to just lay it down on the table.
Okay. This is a picture of the house that we lived in on Peachtree Road. Though you can't see it well, there are several of the servicemen, my mother, my brother, and myself, sitting on the front terrace. They had come to dinner for one of our Sunday dinners.
The rooms that we're looking at, I see 3 windows upstairs. Which were
this is the guest room, bedroom. This is a walk-in closet, and this was my room.
Mm-hmm.
This was the sun parlor, the dining room, the living room, and a porch outside.
Okay. Thank you. You got another picture?
This is a picture of my aunt in her uniform as a first lieutenant and several of the servicemen at our house one Sunday for dinner.
Is that your brother over to the side?
Uh,
On the right
yes,
hand
it
side?
is.
Mm-hmm.
It's my brother. This would be in 1942.
Mm-hmm.
This is a picture of my Aunt Nina and my mother in 1945 when my aunt had just returned from World War II. It's taken in front of Davidson-Paxson in Atlanta, Georgia, and the caption on the back was, "The first shopping trip since discharge from the Army." Mother is carrying a tiny sack, and my aunt is obviously carrying a hat box with a fancy hat inside.
Well, and your mother looks beautiful. Describe what she's wearing there.
She's wearing a very in-fashion hat, gloves, and a dark dress. She has a brooch at her neckline and probably has on the only pair of nylon hose that she owned at that time. We had rayon hose during World War II, and did they sag.
Victory Garden.
This was a picture taken by one of Dad's best friends, Fred Hubble, of Mother and Gladys Hubble, Fred's wife, picking beans on Sunday afternoon, and Gladys was in her Sunday best in our Victory Garden. Fred was a card. He enjoyed teasing everybody, and this is one of the photographs we have from that era.
The dresses they have on, would those be cotton prints?
Mother had on a cotton print, and her petticoat is showing, and it had eyelet ruffle on the bottom of her petticoat.
So a cotton petticoat?
Yeah, it would have been a cotton petticoat. Gladys has on probably a rayon dress. She had been to church and white shoes, and she and Fred had been to church and then come out to enjoy Sunday dinner with us and pick from the garden. The garden was quite lush. We had moved into the house in 1941, and Mother had someone come in and plow up about 1.5 acres in back for her garden. Little did we know that she had selected the area that was right over the drain field to the septic tank until something happened that it flooded, and then we found that out. But I'm telling you, she really had some lush vegetables. This picture is of my mother, my Aunt Nina, my brother Jim, and myself shortly before she went to the service. Before she was dispatched overseas.
So what's the date? When was she dispatched?
In 1943, they went overseas. She was home on leave. This is a picture of myself, Clodie Hubble, and my brother Jim. North of Chambly on a squirrel hunting day with Dad and Fred Hubble. I'm told that that's a trail tree that we're sitting on. This is part of the, I was carrying a rifle, as was my brother and Clody. Clody was in hunting clothes. My brother and I were in casual clothes that we wore at that time. And this is a picture of my dad in front of the same tree. He had a pair of hunting breeches, but unfortunately gained a lot of weight and they didn't fit around the middle. Mother talked the manager at Fulton National Bank out of one of the canvas money bags and made a gusset in the back so it would reach around his middle. And I can recall him being so happy about that.
There is just 1 minute left, so what I'd like to do is just thank you. I'm going to come back up. And I want to thank you very much for sharing your story with us today. It's been a marvelous story, and I have loved doing it, so thank you very much.
Well, you're more than welcome.